There's both a new Crow movie coming out and a new Hellboy, and I thought it'd be interesting to talk about this sort of subgenre of comic book heroes that bleed into horror a bit. So that's what we're doing today. We're ranking what I'm calling superhero horror, but I had some criteria. They had to be based on an existing property, so things like Brightburn weren't included, and I wanted ones that mixed well with the genre. So here's the 11 that I picked. And as always, there's more out there that aren't on here. And some people are going to ask why I used Return of Swamp Thing instead of Swamp Thing. And that's because we just had Swamp Thing on the Wes Craven list not that long ago. And I wanted something new on here. And some people will ask why I used the Guyver 2 instead of the Guyver, since we didn't use that one before. And yeah, I don't have an answer for that, except that the first one is more a kids movie and the second has more of what seems like horror to me. I don't know. But I sent that list to my patrons and I asked them to rank them, with number 1 being the best, and in this case, number 11 being dead last, their least favorite. And these guys answered the call. 49 people sent in rankings, and that means that the best score a movie can have is 49 points. And the worst possible would be 539. And that would be if everyone voted the same film on Dead Last. Something that has never happened in the history of the show, and I'm convinced never will. But now, let's get in there. And you know what time it is.
It's Morbin time.
Coming in at dead last, our lowest scoring film this month, and there was some stiff competition. And at multiple points, there was a tie for this spot until the last couple of rankings made it very clear which film was going to end up here. And with 432 points out of a possible 539. That's right, it's Morbin time indeed. This took the dead last spot 16 times, and that's 33% of the time, a third of the lists. But it had some higher votes as well, even if it never reached number 1. And the best score that it got was second place, which it got one time. And yeah, I had this one in my dead last as well. And oh, the reputation of this one. The meme movie. It's Morbin time. All of that. We'll get to that. But for now, I just want to point out that I'm not sure who keeps on giving Jared Leto all these chances, but can they just stop? Like, never mind the fact that he's apparently a nightmare to work with and one of those Hollywood divas that you hear about. But the guy's just not that good an actor. I don't care if he has an Oscar, because I'm claiming that to be a fluke, because he's not shown an ounce of that talent since. And he sure as hell doesn't show it here. And the painful thing is that Matt Smith is just charming as hell. I would much have preferred to see the two roles swap and have Smith play Morbius and show Leto in that villain role, which he's likely more suited for anyway. And then I hate that they can't even commit to their own premise. They build it as, oh no, we're making a movie about the bad guy. Morbius is an actual villain, but he's the main character now. And then they introduce him and have him kill off a bunch of random guys. So the movie's like, oh look, he's a vicious murderer. But then later on they chicken out and they're all like, oh, those guys were all criminals and we're glad they're dead. And besides that, the idea of Morbius as a character just doesn't really work for this kind of film, because he's basically just super vampire. And when I say super, I mean he's just a vampire. Like, you see, he's based on a character from the Spider-Man comics. And at the time that he was created, there was this comic book code that wouldn't let Marvel have certain types of characters or situations, and one of them was vampires. You weren't allowed to have any sort of undead characters or zombies or whatever. So they had to create Morbius and have him be more of like a super anti-hero, and they called him a living vampire to get around that whole undead thing. But ultimately, he's just a vampire. So it's just not all that interesting, especially because this film plays down the super aspects of it all to have him just be a vamp. But here's the biggest thing that's holding this one back. Like I said earlier, this one has been elevated to meme status and has gotten this reputation of being so bad that everyone had to gang up on it and tell you how awful it is. And it's just so terrible that we have to make jokes. But I'm here to tell you that it's not that. I have this as my dead last because it's boring. I wish that there were more memeable moments in it or something to really dig into at all because it's just this empty, vapid shell of a movie with an empty, vapid lead character. Like the only time that this film has any life at all is when Matt Smith is hamming it up. And damn it, we should have had that the whole movie.
Who the hell are you, Matt?
Me? I
Going on to number 10, and like I said, for a while there, this was close because this movie fought neck and neck with Morbius, and they were tied a couple of times, and at a couple of points, this was in dead last, but at the end of the day, with 423 points, 9 less than the Morbs, we have Marvel's Man-Thing. This one got dead last 11 times, which is 22% of the time, and this also never got first place, and also got second place one time. And I'm on track here because I put this one in 10th place too. So apparently we're on the same page so far, guys. And here's a fun fact. When I was younger, I was super into Marvel Comics, and for some reason, I gravitated towards the weirder end of things. And two of my favorite books were Howard the Duck and Man-Thing. And back then, I had no clue that they were written by the same guy. And we all know how the Howard adaptation went, even though I love that movie. But yeah, it's not the book. But so this is cinema's second chance to do right by Steve Gerber. And you need to understand, this was a weird time for Marvel in terms of film. This is post the X-Men Spider-Man surge, but pre-MCU era. This is when most of the ones that are jeered at arrived. And this had potential. It was from Artisan Entertainment, who were doing some decent things, but it had Brett Leonard directing it, and his reputation is spotty at best. Like, he was a name for a while, and he produced some big hits. And fun fact, he played Jumbo the Clown in Killer Clowns from Outer Space. But by this point, he was a known entity and had done The Lawnmower Man and Virtuosity. And this was actually meant to play theaters. Sort of. It's a bit of a yo-yo. They made it to go straight to video, but then decided to give it a small theatrical run in certain markets. But I guess after a test screening, which didn't go well at all, they scrapped those and it sat on a shelf for 2 years before showing up on the Sci-Fi Channel. And it's mostly terrible. The attempts by the Australian actors at doing an American Southern accent are just comical. And of course, it's become a whole meme of just how many times a guy shouts the name Rodney. I do really like that monster suit, though. It's accurate enough to the comics, but it has its own look. If only we saw it more. But there's just too many problems. It can't decide what it wants to be. It can't decide what they want the Man-Thing to be. Is it a horror story, a superhero tale, an environmental message? Who knows? None of it matters because in the end, it just ends up also being really boring.
Rodney! 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 Rodney!
Coming in at number 9 now, and it was a decent drop down in points because at 384, about 40 less than Man-Thing, and it's one that I'm sad to see so low, and it's Faust, Love of the Damned. This also had some haters since it was put in dead last 8 times, about 16%, and didn't make it to second place like Morbi and Manny, and the best score that it got was 1 third place vote. And I had this one higher up than most of you guys because I had it in 5th. And I love this hot garbage. And look, if you had this one ranked lower, I get it. This movie's a complete disaster. It's a train wreck of massive proportions, and it's awful. But yet it's ridiculously entertaining and humorous in just how over the top it goes. And you know, what a bold movie to make considering the source material. If you're not familiar, the original Faust, Love of the Damned comic was a very adult book that showed up in the late 80s and really upset the apple cart of the industry. Like, when I say that it was adult themed, I mean there were like covers featuring snakes emerging from various body orifices that snakes should probably not be coming from. Seriously, if you've ever seen an issue of Faust, you'd get to like page 3 and then just put it down and say, yeah, no one is ever making a film of that. It'd be impossible. But then Brian Yuzna was like, let me try. And then he made this big old batch of silliness. And there's just so much to talk about here. First up, what the hell, Mark Frost? Like, this guy's been in a ton of things, and he's a solid actor, but the facial contortions that he's busting out here are so over the top and goofy that they defy description. But then everything in this movie is sort of so goofy that it defies description. It seems like incredibly serious content, but it's handled so campy that I'm not sure how to take it all in. The tone just doesn't seem to work. Like the comic book took itself very seriously, but it was very over the top. The movie seems to want to embrace that, but doesn't know how to pull it off with a grim tone, so just goes fun instead. And it sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. Mostly doesn't, but in a way that works in its favor. It is somewhat true to the source, and that's mainly because David Quinn, who wrote the book, does the screenplay here, but he had the hard task of adapting a work that was meant to have an ending that he hadn't written yet. It was a 15-issue series and began in 1988, and there was oftentimes more than a year's gap in between issues. When the film came out in 2000, it was only at around issue 12, with the 13th issue coming out a full 5 years after, and the series wasn't complete until 2012. And yeah, if you're looking for quality filmmaking, you sure as hell aren't finding it here. But you want to know, if you want to laugh, if you want to laugh and say, wait, what? Every 3 minutes, then this one is for you. Let's go to number 8 now, and this one didn't drop down much since it was at 365 points, just around 20 less than Faust. And get ready for some CGI eyesores since we're checking out Spawn. It landed in dead last 5 times, so around 10% of the lists, and it also got second place, but again, only got it 1 time. And I had this one a touch lower because this is the film that I put in 9th, because I sure as hell enjoy watching Faust more than this one. And what's interesting here is that this is one of the only ones on this list that I didn't really have any attachment to the actual comic book. I was never really a big McFarlane fan and wasn't really connected to any of the Image books. So this is one that I'm not as invested in. I still went to go see it in the theater though, and I do know that it's actually somewhat accurate to the source material, because even if I didn't read the book, it felt like Wizard magazine was covering every last detail of what was happening in it. But its biggest issue is that I don't really care about Simmons as a hero. We only meet him for a moment or two before he's killed, and they don't really flesh out his character at all, except to show him accidentally kill a group of innocent people. So I'm not sure that establishes him as a hero that I want to see. When he's changed, he does all of his weeping for his former life, but we, as an audience, never see any of that, so it doesn't have that emotional weight. And then, why does the devil talk like Angela from Night of the Demons?
If you lead my army, you can see Wanda again.
And also, why does the devil look like something from a PS1 cutscene? And I feel like that's slightly insulting to PS1 cutscenes. Like, this is like one of those old Beyond the Mind's Eye things, which were just random CGI experiments that set to house music, and some were nice to look at, and some were god awful. And this looks like the worst of those. And then the movie just takes itself so seriously. It's so mopey and dry. Only the bad guys are allowed to have fun. But boy, do they have fun. Leguizamo is really going for it. But so is Sheen and Melinda Clarke. If there's any reason to watch this movie, they're it. But it stalls whenever they're not around. And what's funny is that a lot of the criticism of this is based around those really shoddy CGI effects, and there's talk about how dated that the 90s digital stuff looks, but the fact of the matter is that we were making fun of it back then. This was crappy even for the time.
Funny's funny, he's our man. If you can't kill him, no one can. Yeah, he's funny. S to the P to the A to the 1. S to the P to the A to the 1. Goes funny, goes funny.
It's lucky number 7 time, and this was the closest call on here because this one only beat Spawn by 2 points, landing at 363. And slipping past is Guyver, Dark Hero. This one was put in dead last 4 times, around 8% of the time, and this should sound familiar. Its best score was 2nd place, which it got 1 time. And you'll notice that so far, every movie has had multiple dead last votes, and also none of them have had any number 1s. And I'm back on track since I have this one right where it landed in 7th place. And now that I'm here and thinking about it, because it had Jeffrey Combs, David Gale, and Linnea Quigley, maybe I should have put the first film on here. I don't know, though, since the first movie was trying to cash in on the whole TMNT feel, and was weird because it didn't know if it was for kids or not. And I love that this movie immediately lets you know it's something different, since the first shot is someone being shot and killed and a guy swearing. It's like they're bending over backwards to tell you that it's closer to its source material than that one was. Also, I love the use of the practical suits. The monsters look fantastic. The Guyver looks fantastic. And there's some really quality fight scenes here, which is no surprise since that's where Steve Wang really excelled, and he'd later do some of that magic on the Power Rangers show. And I know that some people basically compare this to a kind of Power Rangers movie, and that's fair, but it's certainly more violent than that would have ever been. I mean, there's a bit where the Guyver lasers out a villain creature's eyeballs. But there's 2 big problems here. The first, and biggest one, is that it's over 2 hours long and is padded way too much. If this was about a half hour shorter, say 90 minutes, I feel like this would have been much stronger. But instead, it just drags for a good portion of the middle. The second problem is the acting, and not all of it is terrible, but I'm not sure that any of it is that good. Like, some of the actors are downright bad, and the rest are kind of passable. And David Hayter, as our main character, doesn't do much except brood and flare his nostrils. Seriously, if you watch this movie and take a shot every time he flares those suckers up, you'll be passed out around the halfway point. But then, some of the action scenes kick in, and all of that is forgiven, because there are some really cool monster fights here that make it worth your while.
Guyver.
Our number 6 movie, this episode's dead center, as I call it. There's 5 movies after this and then 5 more ahead of it. So this is like average, I guess. And this dropped down a fair amount to 318 points. So about 45 or so less than the Guyver, and it's Ghost Rider. This is the first film on the list to not get a single dead last spot, but it did get a single 10th place nod. And once again, the best score that it got was 2nd place, which it took 2 times as opposed to all those other 1 times. And I had this one a little lower than that since this was my number 8. And I know that I'm going to get some flack for saying this, but the biggest thing that this movie has going against it is Nick Cage. I know that he desperately wanted to be cast as some sort of superhero in this time period, and everyone thought that this was a good fit, but man, does it not work for me. And then he's being weirdly self-indulgent by doing things like drinking martinis filled with jelly beans, and like 90% of the time he's on screen, I can't stop staring at how silly his fake wig looks and whatever they did to his teeth. And yeah, I used to read Ghost Rider, and this movie wants to play the best of both worlds. It wants to use Johnny Blaze and that whole stunt rider thing, but then the Ghost Rider stuff is from another version, like the 90s Danny Ketch one. And the vibe of that was really different. Johnny Blaze Ghost Rider was a more superhero kind of thing, and his villains were all notably off-kilter and strange. And it was the 90s version that had the more cliche supernatural demons and devils and the like. And I think I would have more preferred like a little more of the former here, or at least had interesting villains because Blackheart here is just not it. Which is a bummer because Blackheart is a good character in the comics, but this is pretty removed from that. And with a hero as blank as Ghost Rider, considering that he doesn't talk much and doesn't have facial expressions and not much personality, you need to have a villain that balances that out and counters it. And yup, this doesn't. Plus, I can never forgive this movie for bringing in Sam Elliott, giving him a badass burning skeleton horse, showing me a scene of the two riders riding together, and then just have him exit the film. Like, you made this guy the prologue of the film, so it seems like he's going to be more important, and then he's like, nah, you're on your own, see ya. It's also hilarious that in the beginning of this movie, his dad says the thing about the helicopters.
Be a jump. Me on one side, you on the other, instead of the cars or the ring of fire. A helicopter.
And then a little while later, he does the stunt. And when the copters come down, they actually do a flashback to his dad saying it. Like, it was a half hour ago. We don't need the reminder. And, you know, your main character is a flaming skull wearing a leather jacket, so he shouldn't be hard to mess up, but somehow they do. The skull just looks like sort of derpy and not really all that menacing. Now onto the top half of the roster and our number 5 movie, dropping down around 19 points with a total of 299, is one that I'm sad to see at number 5, really sad, and it's Return of the Swamp Thing. This actually got 3 dead last votes, 6% of them, but it was also ranked in first place 4 times, 8%, so it was in first more than last. But you can see that people were pretty split on this one. But not me, because I thought about it, and I thought about it, and then I said, you know what? This is my number 1. And that's particularly because of my love of the characters. Swamp Thing has always had a special place in my heart. Alan Moore's run was one of the first books I remember reading that put me in awe of what comics could be. I distinctly remember reading the issue where Abby eats the tuber from his chest, and there's the drug trip sex scene, a bit that they reproduce in this movie, and my mind was blown. And then this movie comes out. And this was right at the time that Moore's run was one of the biggest things out there. And it actually utilizes aspects of it. But let me tell you, it's a completely different feel. The book was the first comic to get slapped with a mature reader's label, starting with that whole tuber thing, and featured distinctly adult themes and stories. And then you have this silly film, doubling down on the campier aspects of the first one. But you know what? Somehow they made it work. I don't know how they managed to adapt some of the Moore stuff and make it feel at least a little bit like it, but then still have this zany feeling that is just trademark Wynorski. And I love that they just brought back Arcane and don't even really attempt to explain how he survived the last one. He's just back. Deal with it. And he's making Gigi references to boot. And I have to say, the screenplay on this is actually pretty sharp. The back and forth dialogue is witty, and even though the performances don't nail every delivery, there's some great lines here. And how can I not mention the kids? Oh, those kids. Like the first movie had Jude, and he stole the show. So that one had like what, a wisecracking kid? Ha! We can do that, but we're gonna do 2 of them, and they're gonna crack the wise even crackier than ever. Besides that, this legit feels like a comic book. And keep in mind, this came out in an era the comic book readers were like, hey, we're getting more adult now, and we want more serious, mature themes. However, the mainstream world and TV and movie fans were like, comic books are Batman, bam, boom, piff. And again, somehow this reconciles those 2 things in a way that appeals very heavily to me. So yeah, I'm not sure that it's a better movie than some of the other ones that are ranked up higher than it, but I will put this on and enjoy it before any of those others. Going down to number 4 now, and here's where the points drop down massively, since this next entry fell all the way down to 210 points. A full 89 down from Swamp Thing, and it's Constantine. This did get a single dead last vote, but it was also put into first place 7 times, which is 14% of the time. And I guess this is my spicy ranking because I put this in 6th, and I almost had it in 7th. And look, when I sat down with this list, I made one sort of note for myself. I had to decide how I was going to factor in accuracy to the source material. For the most part, I'm not really all that stressed when live action adaptations take liberties with the comic book versions and change things, so I don't plan to really hold that against movies, except I added one little extra here. Does the movie make me forget about those changes? And this movie does not do that. Constantine in the comic books is supposed to look like Sting, is British, blonde, and is also far more of an asshole. Like, I know that they have him sort of played up as being abrasive here, but trust me, the book version is far more so. Even when they did the later TV show and had an accurate look for him, he still was softened in terms of his personality. And they even changed Chaz, again, Americanizing him and making him significantly younger. But here's the thing, this does not make me forget the book version. Everything about the character on the printed page is better than this. His personality, the tone, the story, even the resolution. You see, the whole cancer thing was one of the most distinct storylines in John's history and was written by Garth Ennis, the guy who did Preacher and created The Boys. And the resolution of that tale was fantastic there. And I would have loved to have seen that on screen because this version just doesn't have that impact. Add to that the fact that it just doesn't have the same vibes that the comics had and ends up coming across as yet another religious-based action horror film. Like, this is several years after End of Days, and the tone of it is basically the same and blends in with any of the films from that genre. Like, I didn't need to see any DC superheroes show up or anything, but you need to give me some sort of sense that this is a more distinct universe. I don't know, just something that's different than any other film that feels and looks just like this. Plus, Keanu is fine as John, but he's 100% not what that role needs and does not pull it off. Keep in mind, this was after the boost to his career from the Matrix films, but he wasn't yet regarded as that awesome guy that works best saying very little. This role needs a certain flair and charm, and that's just not Keanu's thing. Even the film plays Constantine up as the character that can talk his way out of anything. And you know who I don't think of when I think of slick talkers? Keanu. And this was also in the era of putting Shia LaBeouf in things as that same goofy character he is in everything, and I'm just not into it. But thankfully, you have Tilda Swinton coming in and stealing the show, and Rachel Weisz doing her whole thing, even if she's not given a whole lot to do. And it's not a bad movie by any stretch of the imagination, but it's just not really my thing, and not one that I enjoy. Here we go with the top 3 now, and I have to tell you, I thought I knew how this was going to play out, but boy, was I wrong. My prediction for the top 3 was correct, but in reverse order of how it landed. But at number 3, with 171 points, it's one of the guys with a new movie coming out with Hellboy. This didn't get any dead last votes, and also no double-digit score, since the worst it did was 9th place, which it only got 1 time. It was also placed in first 8 times, 1 more than Constantine, and 16% of the time. And I had this in 3rd place, right where it landed. And you know, Hellboy is such a weird character for them to make a movie out of, but I'm so glad that they did. It's just this strange mixture of a superhero tale and a vaguely Lovecraftian lore. And then this film brings Guillermo del Toro in, and he puts his own stamp on it. So it's a lot of things mashed together that still works. And I know that a lot of people prefer the second film to this one, but not me. I like this one more, mainly because this one feels more like the source material to me. This movie still has that nice balance between Mike Mignola and Del Toro, where the second one shifts way harder to the director's sensibilities. But at times, this one feels like the comic book come to life. And like I said earlier, I'm not a stickler for making the film exactly like the book, but in this particular instance, it actually does help. I feel like what the film succeeds with is where the reboot failed. That one wanted to give us a watered down version of what Del Toro was doing instead of swinging further into what Mignola had done. And I love that they ran with a good deal of practical effects here. Hellboy looks great. Abe looks great. The villains are cool. And whereas you could take this whole digital tactic towards bringing this character to life, they didn't. And I think it feels more real because of that. I have a few issues with the storyline and its tendency to lose focus. And I feel like a bit too much time is wasted on Myers. I get that his character was supposed to be like the audience's point of view, like this guy who is seeing all of this for the first time. But I'm never really invested in his storyline or character, and he's not all that important anyway, since they just like blipped him out of there in the next one. Okay, number 2, and I feel like a lot of people out there are biting their nails right now, and this is what really surprised me because at 144 points, a movie that I thought was a lock for first place, it's The Crow. That's right, this got a dead last one time, but it was put into first place 19 times, 39% of the votes. More people thought that this deserved first than thought Morbius deserved a dead last. But it just didn't quite make it because the people that didn't like it, I guess, really didn't like it. And I like it, but maybe not as much as a lot of the other people because I had it in 4th. Although it should be said that I think that this movie's pretty great. And one of the weirder things about this one is watching it while knowing that they didn't finish it before Brandon Lee's death and realizing that almost all of the beginning is not him and it's instead a stunt double. Like, this shot of him walking through the door was early CGI, and footage of him in the alleyway, and every other shot here is not him. And then there's that shot, the first ever CGI replacement, and it's fine. Even 30 years later, it holds up. And that soundtrack, holy crap. It is hard to describe just how much this music encapsulates a very specific period of time. This was an era where a soundtrack could make or break a movie, and this was that weird time where they were making these band-focused hodgepodge of songs and even trying to shoehorn one of the artists into the movies, well, like they do with the Thrill Kill called here. And things may be similar today, but it's also very different since it's all geared towards pop artists now and not this collection of alternative guys and oddball bands. Also, I think it's hard for me to really gauge this one because I love the comic book. And I read it before seeing this movie, and there's no way that I can't compare them. And the movie makes a big change that I feel does the film a disservice. Like in the book, you don't find out if there's anything supernatural occurring until the very end. It's a mystery of whether Eric just survived the attack and is now back after a year of healing and is now getting revenge, or if he's no longer human. And I wish that the film had taken that tact, but oh well. But now, the actual negatives. I think one of the biggest beefs that I have here is the nature of the villains. It's played up like there's this vast criminal empire and a threat to the whole city, and they, light stuff on fire on Devil's Night? In the book, they're just low-level street thugs, but the film tried to make it seem like they were a part of this bigger thing that threatens the entire city, and it just didn't work because they seem remarkably ineffective. Plus, there's a few performances that hold this one back, and I hate to say it because she's a kid, but Sarah's acting really brings this one down because so much of the film hangs on her. And then there's the criminals themselves, and they're maybe playing it a little too over the top at times. Like, again, these guys are meant to be some sort of big threat, and they're just like punching the air and shouting.
I wish the rain would stop just once.
It can't rain all the time.
And that just leaves one man, one hero to slash his way to the top. And it's someone who's had some good news and some bad news recently since his new movie seems to be falling apart. But on the good side, well, I mean, in case people still haven't seen it, I won't spoil things. But let's just say that we've seen this guy recently. And with 125 points, 19 points less than The Crow, it's the man himself, Blade. No dead lasts here again, and only 3 movies here got no dead last votes. This, Hellboy, and Ghost Rider, of all things. It did get one 7th place ranking, which was the lowest that it got, so most of the scores in this were nice and high. And it was put into first place 11 times, 8 less than The Crow for only 22% of the time, but it just had consistently higher scores. And I had this one in 2nd place, so I had a high opinion of it as well. And that's the interesting thing about Dead Last. A movie like this that's generally well liked overall, even if less people think that it's the top spot, can beat a movie that has a bunch of people that adore it, but an equal amount that really do not. And hey, so many people don't realize just how essential this film was to like everything Marvel. Before this, they had a string of disasters, and film versions of Marvel characters were one calamity after another. And then Blade comes around and makes them a thing again. Without this movie, we wouldn't have the X-Men, Spider-Man, and definitely not the MCU. And just think what could have been. At one point, New World Pictures had the rights to Marvel, and this was in the era of them making like The Punisher with Dolph Lundgren, and they had plans to do a Blade movie. Although their version would have had Richard Roundtree as Blade and would have been set in the Old West. And I have to admit, I would have loved to see that, but then we wouldn't have this version, which would have been a shame. But a lot of people forget just how goofy the Blade could be, which was awesome. Like you had the character doing all these badass things and then doing that little fist pump or giving that cheesy grin, and it really added to his personality. There was this extra layer added that seemed like those little moments were the real him, and the hard exterior that he showed all the time was just a pose and character he put up to intimidate vampires and such. But every once in a while, that veil slipped. And remember when I said that I wouldn't let changes made to the character affect me if they made me not realize them? Well, this version of Blade is very far removed from his comics version, and yet it ended up replacing him. Before this film, Blade wasn't well known, but he looked and acted completely different and had a different story to him and an all different supporting cast. But after this movie, anytime Blade would show up, they made him more like this. Everyone forgot the changes because they improved him. And yeah, I'm glad that this is number 1, even if it's not my number 1.
Are you out of your damn mind?
So there you have it, 11 horror superheroes. And there's nothing I'm too mad about. Let's take a look at the list. There's nothing I'm too mad about with this list, but it definitely doesn't match mine. But I'm glad that Blade got first, although I'd have been happy with a number of these at number 1. And I got to say, I'm also particularly glad that Morbius is dead last. Let me know where you would have put everything. Let me know where you would have had in your dead last. Let me know what would have been your number 1. Are you mad that The Crow didn't make it into number 1? Well, your ranking could have changed things. If you go to patreon.com/movietimelines, you can become a patron for as little as $1 a month and participate in these rankings, and your voice can contribute to this list. That's right, you can change the outcome of these rankings every single month by just going there and becoming a patron. I would like also for you guys to enjoy the video, so if you did, hit the like button. If you enjoy what you see on the channel, hit that subscribe button. And also, again, go to my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines and help support the channel like these guys do. Even if you don't want to become a patron that participates in the Dead Last rankings, you can still just go help support the channel. And you can also help support me just by watching this video and sharing it out to your friends. And I'll see you very shortly for another good one. Thanks a lot, guys. See you next time.